Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. This is now a virtual event. My name is Edward Mabaya, and I'm one of the co-organizers for this weekly seminar series, Perspectives in Global Development. Along with my other co-instructors, Terry and Luis, I would like to welcome you to a new semester where we have a new series of speakers ready to tackle some of the pressing challenges in global development on this weekly meeting event. So I just thought I would start off by announcing that the lineup for the spring semester speakers is up already, and the link is going to be shared to everybody in the chat by by Jeff. So please take a note of that, and we hope that you can join us each week. And to the students that are joining this and taking this for credit, please note that every week we do post in attendance, and you should be able to take care of that and fill in your name to make sure that your attendance is recorded. Well, to kick off this seminar, we have a very, very exciting speaker, and I will not steal that thunder. We have actually asked one of our colleagues, Professor Julie Ficarra, to introduce our speaker today. We'll have time for Q&A at the end that I'll moderate. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Julie Ficarra, who is going to introduce our first speaker. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Professor Mabaya. Dr. Fernando Reimers is with us today. He is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of the Global Education and Innovation Initiative and of the International Education Policy Master's Program at Harvard University. An expert in the field of global education, his research and teaching focus on understanding how to educate children and youth so that they can thrive in the 21st century. He is a member of UNESCO's Independent Commission on the Futures of Education, which authored the report Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. He has written or edited 43 academic books on education and several children's books. His most recent publications include Education to Build Back Better, What We Can Learn from Education Reform for a Post-Pandemic World, Primary and Secondary Education During COVID-19, University and School Collaborations During a Pandemic, An Educational Calamity, Learning and Teaching During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Leading Education Through COVID-19, Education and Climate Change, The Role of Universities, Implementing Deeper Learning and 21st Century Reforms, Building an Education Renaissance After a Global Pandemic, Educating Students to Improve the World, as well as Audacious Education Purposes, How Governments Transform the Goals of Education Systems. So without further ado, as a proud 2011 graduate of the International Education Policy Master's Program at Harvard, where I learned such a great deal about global development, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Reimers virtually to the Global Development Department here at Cornell. We are so pleased to have you here with us today, Professor Reimers.
Thank you so much, Professor Ficarra. It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you, Professor Mabaya, and all of you for the opportunity to be in conversation with you today, mostly about what is it that we can do individually and collective to help address the education calamity that has been created by COVID-19, arguably the single most important crisis facing public education since public schools were invented around the world. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes or so to provide some background context for the conversation that I hope we will have. Can you now see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Wonderful. So I want to talk about, I want to basically challenge you to be part of the solution, to be part of building back better. But before I do that, let me take you back in time to January of 2020, when this picture was taken. This was the first meeting of the Commission on the Futures of Education convened by UNESCO. At the very center and front, you see the President of Ethiopia, who is actually the chair of the Commission. And then you see members from all different countries around the world, for the most part, educators as well as political leaders. And we had gotten together to plan an ambitious agenda of the next 2 years in which we were going to travel the world, consult broadly, developing what would be the third report in UNESCO's history to deal with the future. UNESCO, which has 77 years of existence, had only done this twice in its history in response to global crises of different sorts. In 1968, UNESCO asked Edgar Faure, the former Minister of Education of France, to chair a commission that produced the report Learning to Be, published in 1972. And this was in response to a lot of malaise and movements, education movements of students, mostly student protests around the world. In fact, around that time, there was a conference convened at Cornell University, I believe in 1969, that in many ways brought all the very same people that together and serve as the impetus for this report. I've written about that conference and something else, and if you're curious, I can send you that reference. Anyway, the big idea of that report was that the world was going to change considerably over the lifetime of individuals. And as a result of that, the most important set of skills that people could gain in their fundamental education were the skills to learn throughout lives, and hence the report, Learning to Be. The second time that UNESCO convened one of these independent commissions to think about the future of education was in 1992, when it asked Jacques Delors, the eighth president of the European Commission, to chair a commission. And the primary motive of that commission was the increasing digitalization of the economy. With the advent of the microchip, a lot of economic processes were being automated. And there was a clear sense that people were going to need a whole different set of skills if they're going to be able to participate civically and economically. And the big theme of that report was that education, in fact, needed to attend to 4 sets of goals which were intertwined. So certainly had to develop cognitive skills, knowledge, had to develop the capacity to use that knowledge to solve problems, had to develop the capacity to manage oneself. And most importantly, this was the big contribution of that report, it had to equip people to deal with others who had diverse cultural backgrounds. The argument of that report was that globalization was going to bring people into contact frequently and repeatedly with people from different cultural backgrounds. And that unless we were prepared to understand that interconnection, that difference as a source of strength, this would become a source of potential societal conflict. So that was the theme of the report published in 1996. Now, a couple of months after we had our first meeting in Paris, COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. And we convened immediately and we said, what do we do? Do we stop our work? And we said, no, because what is likely to happen, given the attention to the health crisis that this pandemic is creating, is that education is going to be in the back seat. You remember, at this time, a number of countries had already shut down schools and many more would do so in the following months. So the Commission decided, no, this is actually a time to continue with our work. And in fact, we put out a statement at the end of March or April on education, not something we had planned on doing, essentially urging governments to keep education on the front burner of attention in the middle of the crisis. But anyway, it meant that we basically produced this report online. I think because we probably were concerned that our inability to travel was going to limit our plans to consult, we used digital means and consulted in various ways over 1 million people, something we might not have done had we been able to travel. And I'm sure that the fact that we wrote this report in the middle of the pandemic also influenced the content of the report. And the fact that this report presents itself as an invitation to a dialogue. In fact, the report says in multiple places, this is just the beginning of a conversation. The most important work is about to begin as various groups, such as those of you convening today, take the report and ask themselves, what does that mean for us? But let me go back then to what this calamity meant in terms of my research agenda and what I have done. As Julie mentioned, as Professor Ficarra mentioned, I lead the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which is a research practice collaborative whose primary means is to advance knowledge to help transform public education systems so they do a better job providing people the skills they need to participate in a world that demands more skills to participate civically and economically. And when the school shut down, when my university said everybody's going home, my first question was, what's going to happen to my research? And so I basically reached out to a number of colleagues in various development organizations, and I said, let's talk, because I have a sense that this is going to be a very challenging time for education systems, and we should try to be helpful. And the person who responded right away, like within 15 minutes of receiving my email, was Andrea Schleicher, the Director of Education for the OECD. And immediately we're on the phone, and he said, what do you think we should do? I said, Andreas, I have no idea, but why don't we administer a survey through our networks, those of the OECD, those of the Global Initiative, among education authorities, senior system level leaders, ministers, and people working with ministers. And we basically asked them, what plans do they have to continue to teach during the pandemic? What do they anticipate is challenging? Where do they need some help? And within a week, we had collected that survey. Within a week, we had produced a report. By the end of March, we produced this document, a framework to guide essentially an educational response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the basic finding was that nobody had a plan, and everybody anticipated the loss in learning opportunity, the increase in inequality, many of the things that actually came to be. Because we realized that the main finding was the lack of strategy, the lack of preparedness, we said, well, why don't we actually make some suggestions about what a strategy should look like? So we put together a focus groups of basically former and current ministers of education, and we developed a checklist, 25 ideas. And the big theme of that report, other than describing what people were telling us, was everybody should have a strategy, and here are 20 things that the strategy should contain. Because we were all kind of walking in the dark without a clear sense of where was north, this report had a lot of uptake. I believe it's one of the most downloaded publications in the OECD. Many different groups from civil society, governments in different countries reached out and said, I want to translate it in our language. We began to organize convenings on Zoom, and people would come in the thousands, up to 5,000 people in the same meetings. Some of them were across countries, some of them were within countries. And the effect of those conversations, at least for me, was, this is terrible. We're just augmenting something very bad for education. We're just amplifying what we know. This is becoming a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We need to do better than that. We need to provide people some solutions. So we went back to the survey where we had asked people, how do you plan to teach in the pandemic? And I put together a team of graduate students, and we coded that and produced essentially an annotated document with resources, because every jurisdiction, school district, municipality, state, was going to scramble over the next few weeks trying to figure out, how do we teach remotely via radio, learning packets, and so on. And we said, okay, let's simplify their work, telling them at least what resources exist. And that's a document that you see in the bottom. But we also thought it would be useful to begin to document efforts to sustain educational opportunity in the pandemic. And we began to write a series of case studies. And we produced between March and June of 2020, 45 case studies that basically described and analyzed the efforts that people had created to establish alternative ways to educate. And these were national efforts, these were state-level efforts, municipal efforts, efforts from networks of schools, civil society. And we disseminated them. We recently put together all those case studies. This website became widely used. In those months, over 30,000 people accessed that. Because if you remember where we were in April, May of 2020, we didn't even have vaccines. We didn't know how long this was going to last. So this was an attempt to provide useful knowledge that would help people learn from the experience of others. The idea was, well, the world is a big global educational laboratory. Let's document. We couldn't tell that these were good practices because there was no way to look at results, but at least let's document ongoing practices, what people are trying. Anyway, we then back in May did another survey where we examined, so what happened between March and now? Same people that we had surveyed the first time around, and to our surprise, what we discovered is that there had been a lot of innovation, that people had not basically sat on their hands for the most part. There were some exceptions of countries that basically said, we're going to wait these out and shut down the schools. But most countries didn't do that. Most systems didn't do that. And the evaluation of the participants was that the innovation had been less traumatic than they had anticipated. Just recently, we put together those 45 case studies. We went back and we analyzed them with the benefit of a year and a half of hindsight and produced this publication. And the story is a story of great capacity of education systems to innovate, great capacity to innovate in part because these systems attempted a different way to manage during this pandemic. See, during the pandemic, the normal rules that governed the operation of the school system were suspended. And as a result of that, there were many more opportunities for teachers to collaborate with each other in their schools, across schools, for organizations of civil society to collaborate with government, and to produce some solutions. Now, the question is, how effective were they? So that was the topic of, I did convene my partners in the Global Education Partnership, and I said, I think we're going to have to redirect our efforts, put on hold 2 big studies that we had planned on 21st century skills, and instead try to do some studies that are helpful in this moment. And I'll describe both studies. One was a study of how the pandemic had impacted education systems in 13 different countries. And we also had a few chapters that looked globally across countries and what kind of policy responses had been adopted by governments and with what results. And that's this book that presents that. These are the countries on which we did case studies. And the basic findings are that in spite of all the innovation that I have described, and even the innovation that happened here, clearly this was not enough to mitigate, I mean, it may have mitigated, but to protect education systems. The basic story is that this pandemic was a big shock to education system. And the channels through which it impacted education systems are, first of all, outside the schools. It created a new austerity. Some countries did finance extra education expenditures via debt. But for some regions already heavily indebted, this is only postponing what is going to be a very painful period of educational economic adjustment. So there was a new austerity for governments. There was austerity for families, of course, because the pandemic had a recessionary impact. Remember, businesses shut down, industry shut down, no tourism, no flights, no mobility, disruptions in supply chains. And with that, and that impact was regressive. It impacted most the poorest members of society. So that meant that some families were less able to support the education of their kids. There was, of course, the health impact of life loss. Almost 6 million people dead. I believe almost 300 million people who have been infected. If you think that before we had vaccines, being infected meant that you could lose your life. And if you do a quick back of the envelope estimate that for every person infected, at least 3 people, 3 close relatives were impacted, 1 in 8 humans was basically traumatized by this pandemic, thinking that either themselves or a close relative could have lost their lives. That's a huge health impact. And then, of course, there was the now better documented interruption of the regular functioning of schools, leading to learning loss and, even worse, to disengagement of students from schools. And then there were multiplier effects of the pandemic on other pre-existing challenges. What is the synthesis of the lessons in that book? The educational story of the pandemic is not a single story. It's a multiple story. And it's a multiple story because how the pandemic impacted education was mediated, first of all, by the choices governments made, whether they were going to shut down the schools, which everybody did at the beginning, but some governments reopened very quickly, and some governments took a very long time to reopen the schools. Some countries are just reopening schools now, almost 2 years after the pandemic. Another very important policy decision was whether there was a focus on disadvantaged students from the get-go. Portugal, for example, was a country that from the beginning said, as we think about how to handle this pandemic, one of the criteria, one of our targets is going to be, let's make sure that we don't do this for the average child, but that we keep in mind the most vulnerable children. And that made a huge difference. Singapore did something different. In fact, Singapore rehearsed for the pandemic because when they had the very first case come into Singapore, they anticipated that they might have to go into a lockdown. And they said, let's begin to practice with learning online before we shut down the schools. And that helped them discover that many of the children of migrant workers actually didn't have computers at home or good connectivity. And so they targeted resources to those families to make sure that everybody was ready. And when they did shut down the schools, everybody had practiced for a couple of weeks what it meant to teach and learning online. Obviously, another mediating factor was the role of pre-existing conditions. So, for example, Finland had made investments prior to the pandemic in building the capacities of teachers to teach online, in building the capacities of teachers to collaborate, in building curriculum, lessons. So those investments paid off nicely when teachers had to do just that, but now online to figure out a new way to teach their students. Intersectoral coordination, primarily between education and health, but also with those and other authorities, made a big difference in what kind of impact there was, as well as coordination across levels of government. In some countries, certainly smaller countries like Singapore, like Finland, had an easier time. It's much easier to have coherence of policy across levels of government. But large countries with a lot of political tension between levels of government, like the United States, like Mexico, like Brazil, really made a bad situation a lot worse, because the federal government was doing some things, in the case of Brazil, nothing on education, and then the state government had to come and pick up essentially the result of the void created for that. In Mexico, the federal government designed a policy that was inadequate to serve most people because they had no access to what they had done. So municipal and state governments had to basically compensate for those deficiencies. In many cases, they had to ignore the federal policy so that it would work. In the US, we had a real disarray, and the deep inequality in capacity and resources that characterizes the American education system amplified the very distinct impacts of this pandemic in different places. Anyway, leadership made a very big difference. This was one of the findings of the 45 case studies that we had conducted of how people were trying to educate. It brought leadership to the fore as a hugely important factor. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. In the city of Bogota, the very same day that the national government said we're going to close down the school until further notice, the secretary convened on a virtual meeting all school principals in the public schools in the city. And she said, I'm calling for your partnership. I don't know how we're going to teach during this period. I don't even know how long the schools are going to be shut down as a result of the national mandate. But what I think is unacceptable is that we don't do our very best to teach the kids during this crisis. And I trust that together we're going to figure out a solution. The Secretary of Sao Paulo did something similar. That stance that invited collaboration, that opened up the education system to voices from all levels of education, including teachers, and to actors from civil society as well as government, ended up producing much faster and more effective innovation than the stance where the government said, we're in charge, we have this figured out, just let us guide you, because the truth is that no one had this figured out. We didn't have a playbook for how to do that. Anyway, and then some countries and some organizations were a lot better in learning from others, including from other countries, than other places. Now, one conclusion of these and other studies I have conducted is that the pandemic is going to leave us a few good things. The calamity is clear, and I don't want to dwell too much on it because I don't want to contribute to this self-fulfilling prophecy, but put it simply, this is the greatest education calamity in the history of public education globally. But there are some dividends. And so what are some of the dividends? Well, we now all realize that no one learns very much when they're in fear. And that if we're going to educate well, we better educate the whole child. That's an idea that is not new, but it really was not at the front of the policy agenda in many governments. I think it is now and probably will be for a while. There's much greater appreciation of the importance of science and of technology than there was before the pandemic. I mean, we now understand, I was reading this morning in the New York Times, how the United States is one of the countries where the number of deaths per capita is much greater than in any other OECD country. I think only Belgium is close to the US. And the number of people vaccinated is much lower than in any other country. And every educator, myself included, is saying, what is this telling us about our education system and what it has produced? That essentially produces people who believe that following the guidance of public health authorities is a manifestation of your political identity, of your political preferences, of your individuality. We have produced a lot of people who are obviously not well equipped to survive in a world that changes rapidly, in a world with a pandemic, for example. So there is going to be much greater appreciation on the part of educators, for example, in saying we better produce a society that is scientifically literate if you want to have a better chance. Much greater valuing of the importance of communication between families and schools. Much greater appreciation on the part of society of the importance of schools. I think one of the ongoing research themes in the field of education is, do schools matter? To some extent, an absurd question, because it has been asked in contexts where there is very little variation in terms of how many people actually go to school. The only honest way to answer that question would be to compare societies where most people don't go to school versus societies where most people do. And I don't know any studies that have made that comparison. But this pandemic gave us a little bit of a taste of what does society look like when we shut down schools for a year or more. And sadly, we're going to be able to document the consequences of all sorts, economic, psychological, as we follow this COVID generation for years to come. I suspect the findings will not be pretty, even though I am stressing that we shouldn't take it as a fait accompli, that we have lost a generation. We should do everything in our power to recover what we have lost in the last 2 years. We've learned how important collaboration among teachers and other stakeholders is, and the value of partnership. So these are some of the 11, I think, silver linings that are going to remain with us in education. And what I've done in this short book, which I wrote at the request of the International Academy of Education and of UNESCO, where they said, why don't you synthesize what you have learned in the last 2 years studying the educational effects of the pandemic in a way that would be useful, in a way that would help us build back better. I basically said, let's stop talking about learning loss and remedial learning, because there is a very inherent conservative bias in that idea. The conservative bias is we're assuming that the conditions ex ante before the pandemic were great. And we forget that many children were not learning very much or very much of value in schools before this pandemic. So to basically bring our systems back to where they were before the pandemic would show a real poverty of aspirations. Instead, what we should do is we should say, let's try to fix these broken education systems. And that means trying to do 3 things at the same time. Certainly, we have, as we continue in this period of semi-pandemic, then no one is back to normal the way we knew it 2 years ago. We have to pay attention to the competencies that were not developed, not to the contents that were not taught. That would be very ineffective. But we can do something well-known in education called accelerated learning, has been tested. And in the research evidence on the power of accelerated learning, when you compare it to the evidence on remedial learning, it's like day and night. Remedial learning doesn't work. When you try to teach again what you didn't succeed in teaching to a student the first time, for the most part, it doesn't succeed. We have the best example of that in community colleges in the United States. In many places in the US, where access to community college is free, students are tested with some tests like AccuPlacer and so on. And if the test determines that the student hasn't learned in high school the literacy, the language and the math skills that they should, then they put them in remedial education. And remedial education in community college is pretty much the kiss of death. Once you get placed there, you know that you're never going to finish community college. Accelerated learning, in contrast, is about saying, let's concentrate on the competencies and let's figure out a different pathway faster to get you there. So that's one of the things we need to do. Second thing, of course, is we have to make sure that the platforms we have created, which in many places are still hybrid, some in person with some online, are actually more effective than they have been the last 2 years. And then we have to build back better. And that means basically improve the effectiveness of the methods that we have, rebuild educational opportunity, and build the resiliency of the education system. And here's a blueprint, another checklist for what it would mean specifically to do that. I don't know how many of you are interested in the particulars, so I'm going to skip them now, but I'm happy to come back to them in the Q&A if you're interested. So let me just end with a couple of other things. I do think it's really important that we take the time to go back and say, what did we learn? Because we have just gone through a huge experiment in the history of public education, like a solar eclipse, even more rare than a solar eclipse. We did things differently. And it wasn't just that we shut down the schools. Many people tried to do something. So I already mentioned the 45 innovations that we recently published that basically documented things that had happened during the first 4 months of the pandemic. More recently, I conducted another study with my collaborators, and this one was published by UNESCO, I think about a month ago, in which we went back and we looked at innovations that are still ongoing. So these are not the early innovations. And we looked at them through the framework produced by this Commission on the Futures of Education. In other words, the question that we asked was, can we find examples of innovations that happened during this pandemic that anticipate the future that this commission is suggesting we should build in schools? And we found 31, and we basically examined and we said, why are they important to the future of education? The other study of innovations that I conducted with my colleagues in the Global Initiative over the last year and a half is we said, let's look at what universities did during this pandemic, not to sustain the educational opportunities of their own students, but to sustain the educational opportunities of students at the elementary and secondary school level. So we were interested in the question, did universities understand the gravity of the social crisis created by the pandemic? And did they see themselves as entities with the capacity to mitigate that social crisis, looking particularly at the education crisis? And what you see in this book is a study of 20 universities around the world documenting in what manner did they partner with school districts, what did they do? The larger category of studies where this kind of study belongs is the university a learning organization? Is it responsive to complex social challenges? Is it open to the outside environment? And can it shape the outside environment? These are the questions that we attempted to answer in the study. These are the sites. In addition to the 20 case studies, we also administered a survey to about 120 universities. And the book reports those findings. And the basic story is universities produced a lot of educational innovation. And you can categorize the innovations that we found in 7 types. Many of them did research and analysis to support decision makers, the very same things I had been doing in the Global Education Initiative. We saw that across many universities. They realized one of our comparative advantages is the capacity to do analysis. This is a time when education systems need help. Let's help. Second thing is the advanced research-based knowledge of what was happening in schools in the context of the pandemic. Many of them develop education and technology resources or online platforms for students and teachers outside the university. Many of them offer professional development for teachers. In Chile, for example, the president of the country reached out to the presidents of the 2 main universities, one public, one private, and said, I need your help. Why don't we form a social roundtable in which your scientists work with the government, help us figure out what do we need to do in public health and so on. And in education, they help the government streamline the curriculum and enhance the curriculum with an emphasis on social emotional development. And then they develop professional development opportunities for teachers. They also did a lot of advocacy, placed topics on the policy agenda, universities did. They also connected things that were happening in different silos in the university. And lastly, they produced some innovations in teaching, for example, engaging their students in these partnerships with society. So basically, you could categorize these innovations as they created products, solutions, processes, management improvements. And for the most part, they are either evolutionary, meaning new products for new constituencies or existing constituencies. Why were universities able to do that? Because of 3 conditions. Because they had a mission and a strategy that valued social impact, because they already had channels that permitted intra-university integration and collaboration, as well as collaboration. Most of these universities already had some partnerships with school districts, and what they did was to build on them, and they had those pre-existing structures. So to go back to the commission and the report, and I'm just concluding. So we did finish the report, was published in November of last year. It's available in multiple languages. You can download it on this link. And this report basically has three sections. The first part talks about what are the bigger challenges of our times. And it doesn't talk particularly about the pandemic, it also talks about that, but it does talk about climate change and poverty and inequality and social fragmentation and democratic backsliding and the real challenges to human rights around the world. And it argues, unless education systems align what they do more intentionally with those challenges, we're moving backwards around the world. The second section of the report says, well, what do we need to do to address those issues? And it says we have to transform the culture of education. And so this report, the two previous reports are written very much at 30,000 feet. They don't really get inside the black box of educational institutions in the way this report does. And the report says to transform the culture of education means to rethink pedagogy, to rethink curriculum, to reimagine the teaching profession, to reimagine the organization and the architecture of educational institutions, and to build an infrastructure, an ecosystem that supports lifelong learning. And the last piece of the report says, what are the levers to produce that? 3, 4, broad, inclusive, participatory social dialogue. This is a big difference between this third report and the other two. The other two reports are addressed very much to ministers of education, basically built on the implicit model that if governments decide to change education, they can change it. This report is a lot more skeptical of that idea, perhaps because we wrote it in the middle of the pandemic and we saw the failings of many governments to cope with the situation, and says, if the culture of education is going to change, it's because students, teachers, school administrators, families, organizations in civil society have a conversation and decide what needs to change and how. And so the report is addressed to 8 billion humans, to each and every one of you. It's an invitation for you to say, within your sphere of influence, what can you do to transform the culture of education of some of the educational institutions? So that's the main avenue of challenge, broad inclusive dialogue. The second is research and innovation. The third is universities. That's a big difference between this report and the previous two. The first report, Learning to Be, devotes 2 lines to higher education, basically saying they should increase access. The second report, Learning the Treasure Within, devotes 2 pages to higher education. This report talks about the role of universities, and each and every section of the report, seeing universities as institutions that can exercise tremendous leadership in the larger educational ecosystem. It is in many ways an invitation to the higher education community to take responsibility for the construction of a transformed educational ecosystem that goes beyond the traditional constituencies of the universities. Third lever is inclusive dialogue, research and innovation, higher education, and the last lever, reimagine international development and collaboration. So that's where I wanted to end this part of the presentation, with an invitation to each one of you to basically reach out to those that are within your reach and to say, why don't we read this report together and do something about transforming that? Let me give you an example of what this could mean. These are 2 books. The first one was published during the pandemic. The one on the left, the one on the right will be published next week, written by my students, by my graduate students. What I have been doing during the pandemic in a course I teach on education policy is I put my students to work as consulting teams for governments around the world at various levels of government, trying to help them figure out how do we mitigate the impact of the pandemic. And then on the basis of that work, I said, well, let's evaluate what happened here, let's conceptualize it, and let's share it. And that's what these books are doing. I am certain that these students are developing all the skills a graduate student needs to develop in a course of policy analysis, but they're also discovering that they can be part of the solution in what is, without a doubt, the most serious crisis facing public education in recent history. So let me stop here, and I'm ready for a conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Reimers, for wonderful, wonderful presentation and an excellent challenge at the end. With that, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I do ask that you raise your virtual hand, and when I signal you to, you can turn on your camera and ask your question. Please keep them brief so that we can accommodate as many questions as possible. So with that, I open the floor for for questions and comments. All right, we're still warming up there. Anybody with a... Okay, I see a question from Tamara Fischel. If you can unmute yourself and maybe even show your face if you wish.
Yes, I'm trying to show my video, so hopefully it's working now. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm speaking to you from the Southeast Asia program here at Cornell, and we provide outreach for educators, so K through 12 teachers, as well as community college teachers. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought, or if there are resources out there to help those of us who are trying to help teachers internationalize their curriculum, rejigger what we're doing in order to better meet teacher needs during this time. We've found that a lot of the resources that we provide for teachers are not being utilized, and we think it's because they are just so swamped with making the transition back and forth between virtual and in person, and so we're thinking about ways to try to have more materials available online. But we'd love any thoughts you have on how to more effectively train teachers when you're trying to disseminate expertise and knowledge on a world area that's generated in a university, but trying to get it out there in schools.
So Tamara, I think that paradoxically, the pandemic provides us a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to help everybody develop a set of very valuable global competencies, which I think is the goal of internationalizing the curriculum. So when I think about what is the goal of global education, I think about Terence, the Greek playwright, who basically said, I am human, and therefore nothing human is foreign to me. That's what an international curriculum is trying to do. And the pandemic makes it possible for students in every subject, including for our students in universities, to actually understand that. I think that for most teachers around the world, about 80 million teachers around the world at the primary and secondary school, the pandemic has given them an opportunity to be in conversation with colleagues from different geographies in ways they had never done. So you now have teachers who are not the usual suspects that would be drawn to things like internationalization. You now have teachers who've never thought about that, who have picked into a webinar, who have been in conversation with a colleague elsewhere. And I think the challenge for those of us interested in advancing the internationalization is not to try to deliver the content that we had developed for a different time, but is actually take this opportunity and build on that, because I think that we have had immersion of many teachers in what is a medium that is phenomenal to build the global capacities of the teachers, which I think is a precondition for them to actually be able to engage their students in that collaboration. So I don't know of anyone who has curated those resources. I couldn't point you to an example of someone who's done it, but I think it's an opportunity maybe for your center and for your students in connecting. There certainly are very many networks already that have been formed in the pandemic where teachers are in conversations across jurisdictions. So I think the challenge is, let's find those networks and help them do what they're trying to do. In other words, not have them teach things that are what we would recognize as international content. If these are networks that are teaching physics, have them teach physics and learn across different countries what that is. If they're trying to teach zoology, have them teach zoology. If they are teaching literature, have them teach literature. So I think in that sense, when I think about silver linings, maybe the pandemic has impressed on most of us two very important global ideas. One, the idea that we're all in this together, that there is no way, I mean, the pandemic is an object lesson on that. No one is going to be able to ride this pandemic alone, whether that is in a locality, in a nation, or in the world. And we should certainly, in educational institutions, be making that visible. But the other thing that hopefully the pandemic has also done is it has reminded us of the fragility of our own life, of our own vulnerability, and help us find the other in that, help us find that basic interdependence. So I think this is a great time for people interested in global studies and in advancing global education, but it may require that we think anew, out of the box, in terms of what does doing our work mean.
Excellent. Any other questions? You can raise your hand up. I see Sanjeev Kumar. Please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, it was an amazing talk. Thank you for that. I was just wondering, what kind of feedback you received about the role of physical fitness in education?
So I haven't looked at that. I can imagine that where I do have feedback, where I do have information is on how the mental health of students has been impacted by social isolation. So there's definite awareness that the value of in-person education goes well beyond the development of competencies in academic domains, that there is much that students gain from being in a place by being in contact with one another. I would think that on the physical domain there is also, but I haven't looked for them, but I haven't seen anyone examine that in particular. It strikes me as a very important question.
Yeah, I'm finding it does not get emphasized sufficiently. In the US, whenever there is a budget problem, one of the first things that they get rid of is physical fitness education. So,
yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions? If not, I have one question myself. The implications for institutions like yours and Cornell that are kind of downstream to this pandemic, where years later on, students that are going to be applying to these schools are impacted by the policies that their own governments followed in their countries. What do we do as higher level institutions to try and kind of rewind some of that disparity that has been created by the pandemic? Any thoughts on that?
I think we should all try to be helpful. I think that institutions like yours, like the institution where I work, are incredibly privileged. And just the fact that you had access to vaccines, just the fact that I'm sure you were able to go online, that you receive adequate professional support and equipment made visible and in your face how you were the beneficiaries of a very unequal world order. And I don't mean just unequal with other geographies. I mean with other parts of rural, not far from Ithaca, part of rural New York, not far from where you are. And I think in a context like that, what we can all do is ask, so how can I be helpful? How can I use this privilege and the fact that I'm alive and the fact that I have these resources to be helpful to society? To be honest, that was the motivation for that study of the 20 universities. What did universities do? The motivation was twofold: to examine whether, in fact, universities were exercising that social responsibility, and I'm happy to report that they were, but also to convey that to everybody. For example, I studied not my own university, that would have been probably inadequate, but a university down the street called MIT, which is doing wonderful things. And if you want to influence what Harvard does, point to something good that MIT is doing. That'll have a lot more effect than talking about our deficiencies. And that's why I chose MIT, so that I could send this book to our good president and provost and to my colleagues and say, look what our neighbors down the street are actually doing. And I hope that the book will have the same effect in your community, actually. You should all look at what MIT is doing. We should all look at what Arizona State University is doing, which is remarkable. Arizona State University stands, in my mind, as an institution that deeply understands the challenges. I mean, its leader, President, I have his book right here, President Michael Crow, understands the challenges of higher education in America, and that is actually walking the talk. And during this pandemic, it was so evident that this university was a resource to the state and beyond in a way that we could all learn from. So we do have a chapter on what Arizona State University. Maybe one of the things that those of you in the seminar could do is read that chapter and have a little focus group and kind of measure yourself. Say, how do we measure up relative to Arizona State and to MIT? And how do we make sure that that we do better?
Well, Professor Reimers, we're up on our time now, and I really want to thank you on behalf of the Cornell community for an excellent talk. there's one thing that I really miss in this virtual world is really the chance to show appreciation for a speaker like you. So I'll ask that those that can unmute themselves, turn on their cameras, and give a round of applause to Professor Reimers.
On the contrary, I thank you for the opportunity to be in conversation with you. And I'm delighted that you have this community that thinks about development and that you're doing this, even in this challenging time of the pandemic. I think that's just terrific. And I salute you in those efforts. And I thank you for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.